Her tiny voice trembled as she pleaded, "Please don't make me sleep outside." The desperate words of a child echoed through the cold night until fate intervened, when a passing millionaire witnessed her plight and immediately sprang into action. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The wind howled like a wounded beast as it battered the iron gates of Whitfield Manor, slicing through the bitter Yorkshire night with merciless determination. 8-year-old Mary Smith stood trembling at the manor's back entrance, her small fists pressed against the unyielding oak door. Her thin cotton nightgown offered little protection against the biting cold that seemed to seep into her very bones. "Please don't make me sleep outside," Mary whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind's mournful cry. "I promise I'll be good." Her fingers clutched desperately at her only comforts, a tattered woolen blanket, frayed at the edges from years of constant use, and a chipped brass lantern that cast weak, flickering shadows across her pale face. Inside the grand manor, the drawing room basked in the warm glow of golden lamplight. Crystal decanters caught and scattered the light across polished mahogany surfaces, while a fire crackled in the ornate stone hearth. Elizabeth Smith reclined in a high-backed chair, one elegant hand wrapped around a crystal glass of deep red wine. Her immaculate appearance, not a strand of hair out of place despite the late hour, contrasted sharply with the disheveled child outside. "Mrs. Johnson," Elizabeth called to the head housekeeper, who stood nervously by the doorway. "I believe I hear something at the back door. Perhaps a stray animal has wandered onto the grounds again." Her tone remained conversational, as if discussing nothing more significant than the weather forecast. The housekeeper's eyes widened slightly. "But ma'am, it's little Mary out there, and the storm's getting worse by the minute." Elizabeth's face hardened, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I've made my decision. The child needs to learn respect." She took another deliberate sip of wine, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames rather than meeting the housekeeper's concerned eyes. Mary's desperate pleas continued, each one met with a wall of silence, more cutting than any verbal rebuke. The young girl pressed her forehead against the cold door, tears streaming down her cheeks as thunder rumbled ominously across the distant hills. Then came a different sound, the distinctive crunch of tires on gravel, followed by the soft purr of an expensive engine. Headlights swept across the garden, illuminating Mary's small form for a brief, startling moment before darkness reclaimed her. Mrs. Johnson moved quickly to the window. "It's Mr. Smith," she whispered, unable to hide the relief in her voice. "He's returned early from London." Elizabeth's fingers tightened around her glass, knuckles whitening. The unexpected arrival of her estranged husband, the true master of Whitfield Manor, was about to change everything. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the rain-soaked driveway as the black car crunched to a halt on the gravel. From the shadows emerged Robert Smith, his arrival unannounced, yet commanding immediate attention. His silver hair caught the glow of the vehicle's lights, creating a halo effect that contrasted sharply with the grim determination etched across his weathered face. The estate had fallen silent, save for the patter of rain and the soft whimpering of the child. Robert's broad shoulders filled the doorway as he stepped out, his presence immediately altering the atmosphere of Whitfield Manor. His cane tapped sharply against the stone steps, each strike echoing through the hollow halls like a judgment. The sound traveled through the Yorkshire estate, announcing his return to a home he had abandoned years ago. The millionaire paused at the threshold, his journey from distant lands to this moment crystallizing in a single heartbeat. His eyes narrowed as they fell upon Mary Smith, the trembling girl in her thin nightgown. The child clutched her battered blanket, her small frame shivering violently in the bitter night air. Something in her desperate posture struck him deeply, a memory perhaps, or a regret he had carried across oceans. Without uttering a word, Robert shrugged off his heavy wool coat, the expensive fabric still warm from his body. With surprising gentleness for a man of his stature, he wrapped it around Mary's shoulders, enveloping her in warmth that seemed to reach beyond the physical. The coat swallowed her tiny frame, yet she clutched at it instinctively, her wide eyes studying this stranger with equal parts fear and desperate hope. He knelt before her, his knee pressing into the wet stone, unconcerned with the damage to his tailored trousers. For the first time in years, the businessman looked directly into eyes that somehow reflected his own family's legacy. "No child of mine will ever sleep in the cold again," he said, his voice low but carrying the weight of an oath. The words hung in the air between them, a promise that seemed to reverberate through the very foundations of Whitfield Manor. The house itself seemed to shudder in response, as if old ghosts stirred in the walls, awakened by his declaration. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors appeared to watch from their gilded frames, witnesses to this moment of reckoning. The manor, which had stood as a silent accomplice to cruelty, now held its breath, waiting to see if this homecoming would finally bring warmth to its chilled corridors. Mary's tears mingled with the raindrops on her pale cheeks as Robert Smith scooped her up with surprising gentleness for a man of his stature. The wool coat enveloped her small frame completely, its warmth seeping into her bones that had grown accustomed to the persistent chill of neglect. The millionaire's footsteps echoed through the grand entrance hall of Whitfield Manor as he carried her inside, his silver hair catching the soft glow of the wall sconces. "Sir, shall I prepare a hot bath for the young miss?" Mrs. Martha Johnson appeared at his side, her normally composed features betraying shock at the sight of the soaking child in the master's arms. "Immediately," Robert commanded, his voice firm but not unkind, "and bring warm milk with honey to the blue guest room." The servants parted like a startled flock of birds as he ascended the grand staircase. Mary could feel their eyes following, some curious, others concerned, a few disapproving. She buried her face against his shoulder, inhaling the unfamiliar scent of expensive cologne and tobacco. For the first time in months since her arrival at the estate, she felt something beyond cold and fear, a flicker of safety. "You'll be all right now," he murmured, his breath warm against her hair. "No one will put you out again." Mary didn't dare believe his words, yet couldn't help the tiny spark of hope that ignited in her chest. The kindness in his voice was something foreign and precious, like finding water in a desert. From the shadows of the drawing-room doorway, Elizabeth Smith watched the scene unfold, her perfectly manicured fingers tightening around the crystal stem of her wine glass until her knuckles turned white. The burgundy liquid trembled dangerously close to the rim. This wasn't part of her carefully orchestrated plan. Robert wasn't supposed to return for another fortnight, and certainly wasn't meant to develop any attachment to the child. She took a measured sip, mind racing behind her composed exterior. 2 years of meticulous work, cultivating relationships with the trustees, redecorating the manor to her taste, positioning herself as the Lady of Whitfield, all threatened by a shivering child and a guilt-ridden husband. "Shall I serve dinner in the main dining room tonight, madam?" asked one of the younger maids, hovering nervously at the threshold. "No," Elizabeth replied, her voice cutting through the air like ice. "Tell the cook I'll dine privately tonight." She needed time to think, to recalibrate. She had worked too hard to secure her position in this house, sacrificed too much to let a child or a returning millionaire with newfound paternal instincts threaten her plans. Tomorrow, she would remind everyone exactly who controlled Whitfield Manor. Mary Smith awoke with a start, momentarily confused by the unfamiliar softness beneath her. Sunlight streamed through heavy velvet curtains, casting golden patterns across a bedroom larger than any she had ever slept in. The grand guest chamber of Whitfield Manor felt like something from a storybook. Ornate wallpaper, polished wooden furniture, and a four-poster bed that seemed to swallow her small frame. She ran her fingers over the crisp linen sheets, marveling at their smoothness. How different they felt from the threadbare blanket she'd clutched at the back door just hours ago. The memory of last night's cold made her shiver, despite the room's warmth. A gentle knock interrupted her thoughts. The door creaked open, and Martha Johnson entered with measured steps. The head housekeeper carried a silver breakfast tray, her weathered hands steady despite the weight. "Good morning, child," Mrs. Johnson said, her voice low and kind. She placed the tray on the bedside table, the china cups and saucers clinking delicately. Steam rose from a pot of tea, and the scent of freshly baked bread filled the air. "You're safe here, dear," she whispered, her eyes betraying a sympathy that made Mary's throat tighten. The girl nodded, unable to find words. When was the last time someone had brought her breakfast? When was the last time anyone had looked at her with such tenderness? "Mr. Smith has instructed that you're to rest today," the housekeeper continued, pouring tea into a delicate cup. "He's in his study, attending to business matters, but asked to be informed when you awake." Mary wrapped her small hands around the warm teacup, noticing how the staff member glanced nervously toward the door. Outside in the corridor, she could hear hurried footsteps and hushed voices. The manor seemed alive with tension. "Is something wrong?" Mary asked, her voice barely audible. Mrs. Johnson's smile tightened. "Nothing for you to worry about, love." She busied herself adjusting the curtains, letting more light flood the room. "Mrs. Smith is adjusting to the changes." A crash echoed from somewhere downstairs, followed by the sharp tone of Elizabeth's voice. The housekeeper winced. "Eat your breakfast while it's warm," she urged, moving toward the door. "I'll bring you some proper clothes afterward." As Martha left, Mary noticed other staff members passing by the open doorway, their glances sharp and furtive. They moved with unusual haste, some pausing briefly to peer at her before continuing their duties. Mary sank back against the pillows, nibbling at the warm bread. The manor felt like two different worlds colliding, one offering unexpected kindness, the other simmering with unspoken threats. She pulled the blankets closer, wondering how long this fragile safety would last. The morning dew still clung to the grass as Mary Smith ventured outside, her small fingers nervously adjusting the collar of her dress. The Yorkshire air felt fresh against her face, a welcome change from the suffocating tension inside Whitfield Manor. As she rounded the corner of the stone path, a movement near the greenhouse caught her eye. Thomas, the gardener's son, was crouched behind a row of terracotta pots, his freckled face breaking into a wide grin when he spotted her. Soil smudged his hands and cheeks, evidence of helping his father with the morning planting. "Been waiting for you," he whispered, glancing over his shoulder to ensure they were alone. "Got something to show you." Mary approached cautiously. Elizabeth had made it painfully clear that the staff and their children were not to associate with her. The memory of her stepmother's cold voice echoed in her mind. "That child is troubled. Keep your distance." Thomas extended his dirt-stained hand, revealing a small worn picture book. "Can you read?" he asked, his eyes bright with mischief. When Mary shook her head, the boy's grin widened. "I can teach you. My dad taught me last winter." They slipped inside the greenhouse, finding refuge behind towering shelves of seedlings. The glass walls filtered the sunlight into a kaleidoscope of warmth as Thomas opened the book between them. The pages were dog-eared, illustrations faded. But to Mary, it was a treasure beyond measure. "This letter makes the B sound," he explained, pointing to a bold B on the page. "Like in boy and book." Mary traced the letter with trembling fingers, her brow furrowed in concentration. "B," she whispered as if tasting the sound. They moved through the alphabet, Thomas patiently sounding out words while Mary repeated them. Each new letter felt like a key unlocking a door she hadn't known existed. When she correctly read her first complete word, cat, both children dissolved into giggles, quickly muffling their laughter behind cupped hands. For 2 hours, they huddled among the plants, the outside world forgotten. Mary felt something unfamiliar bloom inside her chest. Friendship, perhaps, or simply the joy of being treated as worthy of someone's time. A sudden crash of pottery from outside sent them scrambling. Thomas quickly tucked the book behind a large flower pot. "Same time tomorrow?" he whispered, already backing toward the door. Mary nodded eagerly, but her heart raced with fear. If Elizabeth discovered their secret lessons, the consequences would be severe. Every creaking floorboard, every echoing footstep in the manor now carried potential danger. Yet as she watched her new friend dash across the grounds toward his father's cottage, Mary clutched this new secret close. In a world where warmth was rationed, these stolen moments of learning felt like rebellion and hope. The autumn chill seeped through the stable walls as Mary Smith curled up in the hayloft, her small body nestled in the warmth of dried grass. She had escaped there after finishing her chores, finding comfort in the gentle nickering of horses below and the earthy scent that reminded her of simpler days. Her eyelids grew heavy as she clutched her battered doll, the one companion who never judged or abandoned her. The stable door crashed open. Elizabeth Smith stood there, her silhouette sharp against the dying light, eyes scanning the shadows until they locked onto the child's hiding place. "Get down here this instant," Elizabeth commanded, her voice cutting through the peaceful sanctuary. Mary scrambled down the wooden ladder, hay clinging to her worn dress. Before she could steady herself, her stepmother's fingers dug into her arm, dragging her across the cobblestone yard. The girl stumbled, trying to keep pace with Elizabeth's furious strides. "You disgrace this family," Elizabeth hissed, her perfectly manicured nails leaving crescent marks on Mary's skin. What would the neighbors think, finding Robert Smith's stepdaughter sleeping with animals like some vagrant? Servants averted their eyes as the pair passed. Even Mrs. Johnson, who had shown Mary kindness in secret, could only offer a pained glance before busying herself with the evening preparations. The housekeeper's sympathetic gaze, however brief, gave Mary strength. "I was just resting," Mary whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind sweeping across the Yorkshire estate. "Silence!" Elizabeth's face contorted with disgust. "You'll take your dinner in your room tonight. Perhaps hunger will teach you proper behavior." The humiliation burned hotter than any physical pain as Elizabeth marched her through the kitchen, past Thomas and his father, who were delivering vegetables from the garden. The boy attempted a small, encouraging smile, but quickly lowered his head when his father placed a warning hand on his shoulder. Later, alone in the attic where she had made her refuge, Mary hugged her knees to her chest. No tears came. She had learned that crying solved nothing at Whitfield Manor. Instead, she retrieved her doll from the pocket of her dress, smoothing its tattered fabric with gentle fingers. "I won't forget," she whispered to the doll, her only audience in the vast emptiness of the manor's highest room. "I'll remember everything. How Mrs. Johnson slips me extra bread when no one's looking. How Thomas taught me new words yesterday. How the gardener nods at me when Elizabeth isn't watching." Mary traced the patterns of moonlight on the floorboards, committing them to memory like everything else. The creaking third step on the back staircase, the loose brick in the garden wall, the way Elizabeth's voice changed when Robert entered a room. Someday, she promised her silent companion, all these secrets will matter. Robert Smith stood by the library window, watching Mary play in the garden with a hesitant curiosity. The afternoon light caught her profile, and he felt a jolt of recognition that nearly stole his breath. Those determined eyes, the slight tilt of her chin when concentrating, they were unmistakably Caroline's features, his late sister-in-law's, preserved in this small, resilient child. "How could I have been so blind?" he whispered to himself, tapping his cane against the polished floor. Years of business dealings across continents had kept him away. But that excuse felt hollow now, faced with the living reminder of his brother's wife. Guilt settled heavily on his shoulders. While he'd been accumulating wealth in foreign markets, this child had been left to Elizabeth's cold mercies. The thought made his jaw clench. That evening, he instructed Mrs. Liley Johnson to invite Mary for afternoon tea in the library the following day. When Mary arrived, she stood awkwardly at the threshold, her small fingers clutching the doorframe. The grand room with its towering bookshelves seemed to swallow her whole. "Come in, Mary," Robert said, softening his usually commanding voice. "I thought we might share some tea." She approached cautiously, perching on the edge of an armchair, like a sparrow ready to flee. The housekeeper had prepared a tray with delicate china cups and a plate of shortbread, treats Mary eyed but didn't touch. "I spent 5 years in India," Robert began, pouring tea for them both. "The markets there are a symphony of color and sound." He described spice-laden air and silk merchants, elephant processions and ancient temples. Mary remained silent, but her eyes widened with each new detail. Their meetings became a daily ritual. Robert filled the silence with tales of his travels: Japanese cherry blossoms, African savannas, Brazilian rainforests. Sometimes his stories faltered, giving way to quieter confessions. "I should have returned sooner," he admitted one rainy afternoon. "Your mother, Caroline, she would be disappointed in how I've neglected my responsibilities." On the 7th day, Mary brought a small notepad. As Robert described the northern lights he'd witnessed in Norway, she began to sketch, her small hand moving deliberately across the paper. When she finished, she hesitantly slid the drawing across the polished table. It was a simple rendering of swirling lights above a tiny figure standing alone. "Is that you?" Robert asked gently. Mary nodded, then whispered her first words to him. "Sometimes I dream of seeing beautiful things too." Something shifted between them, a bridge beginning to form across years of absence. Robert carefully placed the drawing in his breast pocket, close to his heart, and continued his story with renewed purpose. Elizabeth Smith paced the drawing room, her heels clicking against the polished floor as she sipped her third glass of wine. The afternoon tea with the Whitfield village ladies was going exactly as planned. She leaned in, lowering her voice to a confidential whisper. "I worry so for the child," she said, her eyes wide with manufactured concern. "Just yesterday, Mary was found talking to herself in the garden. The doctor believes it might be hereditary instability." The ladies exchanged glances. Teacups paused midway to their lips. Mrs. Harrington, the vicar's wife, clicked her tongue sympathetically, while Lady Pembroke raised a perfectly arched eyebrow. "Her mother had similar episodes, I'm told," Elizabeth continued, strategically dabbing at the corner of her eye. Robert tries to ignore it, but a man can only deny reality for so long. By evening, whispers had spread through the village like wildfire. The shopkeeper's wife mentioned to the postmaster how the Smith heiress was touched in the head. The butcher nodded knowingly when told the girl was wild as the Moors themselves. At the pub, men shook their heads over pints, lamenting how such a prestigious family had been stained by madness. Meanwhile, in the library, Robert sat across from Mary, watching as her small fingers moved confidently across paper. Her sketches had evolved from childish scrawls to detailed renderings of the estate grounds, complete with hidden pathways only a keen observer would notice. "Tell me about this one," he said, pointing to a drawing of the greenhouse. Mary looked up, her eyes clear and intelligent. "Thomas showed me how the rose bushes make shadows that look like dancers when the sun sets. See here?" She traced the pattern with her finger. "Mrs. Johnson says my mother loved those roses too." Robert studied her face, finding no trace of the instability Elizabeth had described to the household staff. Instead, he saw a sharp mind cataloging everything around her. When Elizabeth claimed at dinner that Mary had thrown a tantrum in the village, the child simply produced her sketchbook, showing she'd been drawing the church spire all afternoon, verified by the gardener's signature and time. When Elizabeth suggested Mary had broken a valuable vase, Mrs. Johnson quietly confirmed finding the house cat among the shards. For each fabrication, Mary offered only truth, not with angry denials, but with steady evidence and unwavering gaze. This quiet resistance unsettled the adults far more than any outburst could have. Elizabeth's lips thinned as she watched her influence over the household slowly erode. The girl was proving more formidable than she had anticipated, not through defiance, but through a resilience that seemed to grow stronger with each challenge. Rain drummed against the greenhouse glass, turning the world outside into a watercolor blur. Mary huddled with Thomas behind a row of potted hydrangeas, their heads bent close over a crumpled piece of paper. The gardener's son had found it stuffed behind a loose board while helping his father clear out the greenhouse rubbish. "Look here," Thomas whispered, his finger tracing the faded ink. "That's your name, isn't it?" Mary Smith leaned closer, her heart skipping a beat as she recognized her full name written in elegant script. The document was weathered and torn at the edges, but unmistakably a will. Her fingers trembled as she touched the paper, feeling as if she were holding a piece of her own history. "I can't read all these big words," she admitted, frustration coloring her voice. Thomas grinned, dirt smudged across his freckled face. "That's why you've got me. My dad made sure I could read proper." He squinted at the document, sounding out the complex legal terms with careful determination. As they deciphered the tangled words together, Mary's eyes widened. The will mentioned Whitfield Manor specifically, and her right to inherit it. According to the document, her mother had made provisions ensuring Mary would be the primary beneficiary of the estate upon reaching adulthood, with Robert Smith serving as trustee until then. "This means Mrs. Elizabeth isn't supposed to control anything," Thomas whispered, his voice tinged with awe. "She's just temporary." Mary sat back against the damp greenhouse wall, trying to make sense of this revelation. All those nights spent shivering outside, all the cruel words and cold glances. Elizabeth had known all along that Whitfield Manor would never truly be hers. "We need to tell Mr. Smith," Thomas urged, already folding the paper carefully. Mary placed her hand over his. "Not yet," she said quietly. "Elizabeth might destroy it. We need to understand everything first." She thought of her stepmother's calculating eyes, the way she whispered to the solicitor during his visits. "There's more to find, I'm sure of it." They made a pact that afternoon, huddled among the fragrant herbs and flowering plants. Thomas would teach Mary to read better, and together, they would uncover the truth about her inheritance. The estate's future hung in the balance, its rightful ownership a puzzle waiting to be solved. As they slipped back toward the manor, Mary clutched the will inside her dress pocket. For the first time since her mother's death, she felt something powerful stirring within her. Not just hope, but determination. The truth shimmered just out of reach, waiting for someone brave enough to claim it. And Mary Smith, despite her small stature and young age, was finding her courage growing stronger every day. Whitfield Manor glittered under the chandeliers as Elizabeth Smith's grand gala filled every corner with light and sound. Crystal glasses clinked while string quartet notes floated through the air. Elizabeth had spared no expense, calling it a celebration of new beginnings. For the estate, though everyone understood it was a calculated display of her position as lady of the house. Remember, Elizabeth had instructed Mary earlier that evening, her voice sharp as she adjusted her pearl necklace. "You are to remain upstairs. These are important people who don't need to be bothered by a child." Mary nodded silently, watching from the landing as guests in tailored suits and flowing gowns arrived. The little girl pressed herself against the banister, drinking in the colors and sounds of a world she wasn't allowed to join. Mrs. Martha Johnson passed by with a tray of canapes, giving Mary a sympathetic wink before disappearing into the crowd. From her hidden vantage point, Mary observed Robert moving through the gathering, his silver hair catching the light as he greeted guests with practiced charm. Though he searched the room occasionally, Elizabeth had ensured he believed Mary was being cared for elsewhere. The evening progressed until a commotion near the grand piano caught everyone's attention. The hired pianist, a thin man with trembling hands, had suddenly taken ill. Elizabeth's perfect facade cracked momentarily as she whispered urgently to the staff. "Perhaps we should conclude the musical portion," she announced with forced brightness. But the disappointment among the guests was palpable. Something stirred in Mary then, a memory of sitting beside her mother at this very piano, small fingers guided over ivory keys. Before she could reconsider, Mary slipped down the stairs and through the distracted crowd. The bench was still warm when she climbed onto it. For a moment, no one noticed the small figure at the massive instrument. Then, her fingers touched the keys, and the first notes of a forgotten melody filled the room. Conversations halted. Wine glasses paused midway to lips. The haunting tune, simple yet profoundly moving, spread through the manor like a spell being cast. It was her mother's favorite song, one Mary had practiced in secret during lonely afternoons. Robert turned slowly, his eyes widening as he recognized both the melody and the small performer. Across the room, Elizabeth stood frozen, her carefully orchestrated evening now centered on the child she'd tried to render invisible. As the final notes faded, silence held the room captive for 3 heartbeats before applause erupted. Guests whispered questions about the remarkable child. For the first time in years, joy echoed through Whitfield Manor's halls. Not the manufactured gaiety of Elizabeth's gathering, but something authentic that seemed to awaken the very soul of the estate. The last note lingered in the air as silence fell over the grand hall. Robert Smith sat frozen, his cane forgotten at his side, tears streaming down his weathered face. The melody had pierced through years of carefully constructed barriers, transporting him back to evenings when his brother would request that very song, claiming it spoke of home better than words ever could. "Where did you learn that piece?" Robert asked, his voice barely above a whisper as he approached the piano where Mary sat, her small fingers still resting on the ivory keys. "My mother used to sing it," she replied simply, "before she got sick." The connection struck Robert like lightning. This child wasn't just his legal responsibility. She was the living embodiment of his brother's legacy, carrying memories and talents he'd thought lost forever. In her determined eyes, he saw the future of Whitfield Manor, its rightful heartbeat. Across the room, Elizabeth Smith's smile had calcified into something brittle and dangerous. She watched as guests clustered around the piano, murmuring appreciatively about the Smith family talent and how extraordinary the child is. Her carefully orchestrated evening, meant to secure her position among Yorkshire's elite, was unraveling thread by thread. "Such a charming party piece," Elizabeth said, gliding toward the piano. Her voice dripped with sweetness that didn't reach her eyes. "But I believe it's past someone's bedtime." Robert straightened his back. "Let her stay," he countered, placing a protective hand on Mary's shoulder. "This is as much her home as anyone's." The housekeeper, Mrs. Johnson, watched from near the refreshment table, her lined face betraying a flicker of satisfaction. She caught Mary's eye and offered an almost imperceptible nod of encouragement. Later, as the guests departed into the cool Yorkshire night, Elizabeth cornered her husband in his study. "You're making a spectacle of us both," she hissed. "That child needs discipline, not indulgence." "That child," Robert replied evenly, "has shown more grace tonight than you've demonstrated in years." Elizabeth's fingers tightened around her crystal glass. Everything she'd built, her position, her security, her carefully crafted narrative, was threatened by a 9-year-old girl and an old man's sentimentality. She would not surrender without a fight. As moonlight spilled across the estate grounds, Mary stood at her bedroom window, watching the last carriages disappear down the winding drive. For the first time since arriving at Whitfield Manor, she felt something beyond fear or loneliness. something that might, with careful tending, grow into belonging. In her room, Elizabeth paced, formulating new strategies. There was still the matter of the trust, the documents hidden in the library safe, the connections she'd cultivated in the village. She had too much to lose, far too much. Thunder crashed over Whitfield Manor as rain lashed against the ancient stone walls. The storm had arrived with unexpected fury, turning the Yorkshire hills into rushing rivers that threatened the estate's foundations. Water seeped through cracks in the old chapel and pooled in the lower corridors, while servants rushed to place buckets under leaking ceilings. Robert Smith stood at the grand window, watching lightning split the sky. The sudden flash illuminated the flooded gardens, where Thomas and his father worked frantically to divert water from the greenhouse. When Mrs. Johnson burst into the room, her face pale with worry, Robert knew something was terribly wrong. "It's Mary, sir," the housekeeper gasped. "She's nowhere to be found. I've checked her bedroom, the library, everywhere." Panic gripped Robert's heart. "When was she last seen?" he demanded, already reaching for his cane. "Just before the storm hit. Elizabeth sent her to her room, but—" Martha wrung her hands, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I heard them arguing about some letters." Robert's jaw tightened. Of course Elizabeth would choose today of all days to torment the child. Without another word, he gathered the staff, organizing them into search parties despite the howling wind and rising water. "Sir, the east wing is flooded," one of the footmen reported, "and the cellars completely underwater." As the search continued, Elizabeth remained in the drawing room, sipping brandy with affected calm. "She's just seeking attention," she remarked coldly when Robert demanded her help. "The girl has always been dramatic." But Robert knew better. Something in his heart pulled him toward the old chapel, a building rarely used, standing separate from the main house. As he approached through the driving rain, he thought he heard something faint beneath the storm's roar. A melody, delicate piano notes, played from memory. Following the sound in the dim glow of light, he pushed open the heavy chapel door. Water had begun to seep under the threshold, but the ancient stone floor remained mostly dry. There, huddled beneath the stained glass window, sat Mary. A small candle flickered beside her as she clutched a wooden box to her chest, her fingers white with effort. "Mary," Robert called softly. She looked up, tears streaming down her face. "I couldn't let them get wet," she explained, opening the box to reveal a collection of letters tied with faded ribbon. "They're all I have of her." Robert knelt beside her, ignoring the pain in his leg. "Your mother's letters?" Mary nodded. "Elizabeth said they were trash. She tried to throw them away when the storm started." Gently, Robert wrapped his arm around her small shoulders. "Nothing of your mother's will ever be trash," he promised, "and neither are you." Together they protected the precious letters as the storm raged on, unaware that these fragile papers would soon reveal truths strong enough to reshape their future. As the waters receded from Whitfield Manor, Mary Smith spent her afternoons sorting through the few possessions she'd managed to save from the chapel. The storm had left its mark on the estate, damp walls, muddy carpets, and a strange, unsettled feeling that hung in the air like mist. While reorganizing her small wooden toy box, her fingers brushed against something cold and metallic wedged in the corner. Mary pulled out a tarnished silver locket, its chain broken and clasp damaged. She'd never seen it before, yet somehow it felt familiar in her small hands. "What have you found there?" Mrs. Martha Johnson asked, pausing in the doorway with fresh linens. "A locket," Mary whispered, working her fingernail into the tiny groove. The housekeeper set down her basket and moved closer as the locket finally clicked open. Inside lay a faded photograph, creased, but clear enough to recognize two smiling faces, her mother's gentle eyes and her father's proud smile. They looked so happy, so alive. Mary's heart tightened. Behind the photo, tucked into the locket's frame, was a yellowed slip of paper with faint handwriting. "The truth lies beneath the roses where we first danced." "That's your mother's handwriting," Mrs. Johnson said softly, her eyes glistening. "She wore that locket every day until—" Mary clutched the treasure to her chest. "Elizabeth must have hidden it from me." That night, unable to sleep, the girl sat by her window, watching moonlight spill across the estate grounds. The cryptic message played over and over in her mind. The roses? Could it mean the rose garden where her parents had celebrated their anniversary? Thomas had once mentioned an old stone bench there, covered with carvings of dancing figures. She glanced toward Elizabeth's wing of the house, where lights still burned behind heavy curtains. The woman who had forced her to sleep in the cold, who had tried to erase her mother's memory, was still plotting. Mary could feel it. "I'll find what you're hiding," she whispered, tracing the outline of the locket. "Whatever it is, I'll find it." The child who had once begged for warmth now felt a different kind of fire within her. Determination. Tomorrow, she would ask Thomas to help her search the rose garden. Tomorrow, she would begin unraveling the mystery her mother had left behind. Mary tucked the locket beneath her pillow, her mind racing with possibilities. What secrets lay buried at Whitfield Manor? What truth was so dangerous that Elizabeth would go to such lengths to conceal it? Whatever it was, Mary resolved to discover it, even if it meant risking everything she had gained since Robert's return. Mary clutched her battered doll to her chest as she sat cross-legged on her bed. The stuffed companion had been her only constant friend through years of Elizabeth's coldness. Running her fingers along the worn fabric, she noticed something peculiar. A section of stitching that didn't match the rest. Slightly darker thread forming an almost invisible pocket along the doll's side seam. "What's this?" she whispered, heart quickening. With trembling fingers, she carefully unpicked the stitches. Something metal glinted inside. Mary gasped as she extracted a small, ornate brass key, its teeth intricate and its handle formed in the shape of a rose. That evening, as the Yorkshire wind howled outside Whitfield Manor, Mary slipped a note under the greenhouse door. By morning, Thomas had responded with a time, midnight, when Elizabeth took her sleeping tablets and the night staff changed shifts. "Are you sure about this?" Thomas whispered as they tiptoed through the darkened library. His mischievous smile was replaced with genuine concern, his eyes darting toward the door. "I've seen Robert unlock something behind these shelves," Mary explained, running her hands along the mahogany bookcase. "He doesn't know I was watching." The gardener's son helped her slide the heavy shelf aside, revealing an ornate keyhole set into the paneling. Mary's hand shook as she inserted the delicate key. It turned with a satisfying click. The hidden room smelled of dust and secrets. Moonlight filtered through a small window, illuminating stacks of leather-bound journals and boxes of letters tied with faded ribbon. Mary recognized her mother's handwriting immediately. "These are Mum's," she breathed, opening the first journal with reverence. For 2 hours, they read by torchlight. The journals told a story of love and betrayal. Her mother's devotion to Robert, her fears about Elizabeth's growing influence, and her desperate attempts to protect Mary's inheritance. "Look at this." Thomas pointed to a letter dated 3 years before. "Your mother suspected Elizabeth was intercepting correspondence." Mary's eyes widened as she found drafts of letters her mother had written to Robert during his business travels. Warm, loving letters he claimed never to have received. Instead, there were cold, dismissive forgeries in Elizabeth's handwriting, designed to drive him away from England. "She wanted him gone," Mary whispered, "so she could control everything, the estate, the money. And you," Thomas added softly. As they carefully returned everything to its place, Mary slipped one journal into her nightgown, the one containing her mother's final entries. The truth was finally emerging from the shadows, like delicate flowers pushing through winter soil. "We need to show this to Robert," Mary said. determination hardening her voice. "But we must be careful. Elizabeth can't know what we found." Thomas nodded, squeezing her hand as they locked the hidden room, the key once again disappearing into the doll's secret pocket. Robert Smith stood in the dimly lit study of his oldest friend, Dr. Harold Wells, the village physician whose hands had trembled as he handed over the yellowed medical reports. The millionaire's fingers tightened around his cane as he scanned the documents, his jaw clenching with each revelation. "You falsified these records," Robert said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You declared Catherine unfit, mentally unstable, when she was nothing of the sort." The doctor slumped into his leather chair. "Elizabeth paid me handsomely, said it was for Mary's protection." He couldn't meet Robert's gaze. "I've regretted it every day since." Outside, rain pelted the windows of the small village practice as Robert pieced together the cruel puzzle. Elizabeth had orchestrated everything: the false diagnosis, the mysterious illness, even the letters that had driven him abroad, convinced his wife no longer wanted him at Whitfield Manor. Back at the estate, Robert pored over financial records in the library. The trail was clear now. Substantial payments to the doctor, bribes to solicitors, all designed to remove Catherine from the line of succession and place Elizabeth in control of the estate's fortunes. That evening, he found James, Thomas's father, pruning roses in the greenhouse. The gardener straightened when he saw Robert approach, his weathered face solemn in the fading light. "I need to know what happened the night Catherine fell ill," Robert said. James set down his shears. "I've carried this too long, sir." The gardener's voice was rough with emotion. "I saw Elizabeth enter the east wing with a small bottle. She added something to your wife's evening tea." He looked away. By morning, the mistress couldn't speak properly. The doctor came and declared her unfit to make decisions. Robert closed his eyes, the weight of his absence crushing down on him. While he'd been chasing business ventures abroad, believing Catherine had rejected him, his wife had been systematically destroyed by the woman he'd foolishly trusted. "Thomas knows some of this," James continued. "That's why he's been helping Mary. The boy has his mother's sense of justice." In the manor's west wing, Mary sat cross-legged on her bedroom floor, carefully arranging the fragments of truth she'd gathered. She didn't hear Robert enter until his shadow fell across her collection of notes and drawings. "I know what happened to your mother," he said gently. Mary looked up, her young face showing wisdom beyond her years. "Is that why you came back?" Robert knelt beside her, his silver hair catching the lamplight. "I came back for business. I stayed because of you." The truth was unraveling, thread by painful thread, and with each revelation, the bonds between Mary and Robert grew stronger than blood could ever forge. Elizabeth Smith paced the drawing room, her heels clicking against the polished floor like a ticking clock. The walls of Whitfield Manor seemed to be closing in around her. Outside, rain lashed against the windows as if nature itself were trying to break through and expose her secrets. "I've warned you repeatedly about that girl," she hissed at Thomas's father as he stood with his cap in his hands. "Your son is forbidden from speaking to Mary. Do you understand? One more incident and you'll all be looking for new positions and lodgings." The gardener nodded stiffly, his weathered face masking the anger he felt. He knew Robert would never allow such an eviction, but Elizabeth still wielded enough power to make their lives miserable. That evening, Elizabeth discovered Mary hunched over one of her mother's letters in the library. With a swift motion, she snatched the delicate paper and held it to a nearby candle. Mary watched in horror as the flames devoured her mother's handwriting, reducing precious words to ash. "Childish fantasies," Elizabeth said coldly. "It's time you learned your place in this household." But Mary had endured too much to break now. That night, she slipped into the attic and retrieved her battered doll, whispering her plans into its worn fabric ear. "We won't let her win," she promised. The next morning, Mary began methodically organizing the library shelves, appearing to submit to her stepmother's will. What Elizabeth didn't notice was how the child carefully documented each book's location, creating a system only she understood. Behind certain volumes, she tucked small notes, observations, conversations overheard, dates and times. When the estate's solicitor visited, Mary quietly placed herself in the adjacent room, her small ear pressed against the wall. She heard Elizabeth's voice rise and fall, catching fragments about mental instability and family reputation. Each poisonous word was carefully recorded in a small notebook hidden inside her doll. Mrs. Johnson noticed Mary's new determination and silently supported her, creating diversions when necessary. "The child has her mother's spirit," she whispered to Thomas's father one evening as they watched Mary slip into Robert's study to examine financial documents. Elizabeth's cruelty grew more desperate with each passing day. She locked away Mary's shoes to keep her confined indoors. She accidentally spilled ink on Mary's drawings. She spread rumors among the village shopkeepers about the child's dangerous tendencies. But for every act of malice, Mary responded with quiet resilience. She was no longer just surviving. She was building a case, piece by methodical piece. The little girl who had once begged not to sleep outside was now gathering the evidence that would ensure she would never have to beg again. Martha Johnson moved silently through the manor's corridors, her footsteps barely audible on the thick carpet. In her hands, she carried Mary's latest drawing, a vibrant depiction of the estate's gardens with Thomas and his father tending to spring flowers. The housekeeper smiled, noting how the child's artistic skill had improved over recent months. She reached her quarters and unlocked the bottom drawer of her wardrobe with a small brass key. Inside lay dozens of Mary's drawings, carefully dated and preserved between sheets of tissue paper. Each illustration told a story, from the early frightened sketches of locked doors and shadowy figures to more recent ones filled with color and hope. "One day," Martha whispered to herself, "these will show everyone who Mary truly is." She believed the drawings revealed not just the child's talent, but her remarkable spirit, how she saw beauty even during her darkest days at Whitfield Manor. Meanwhile, in the library, Robert Smith sat at his mahogany desk, fountain pen moving steadily across cream-colored paper. The silver-haired millionaire had begun documenting his life's journey. The business triumphs abroad, the painful estrangement from his brother's family, and his shameful absence during Mary's early years. "I abandoned this house to ghosts and vultures," he wrote, pausing to glance at a photograph of Mary he'd placed on his desk. "And in doing so, I nearly lost the most precious thing of all." Robert found writing therapeutic. Each confession loosened the knot of guilt he'd carried since leaving Yorkshire years ago. He documented Elizabeth's manipulations, how she had intercepted letters, spread falsehoods about Mary's mother, and systematically isolated the child from affection. One evening, Mary knocked timidly on the library door, clutching a book Thomas had helped her read. Robert welcomed her with a warm smile, setting aside his memoirs. "Would you like to hear a story?" she asked, her voice stronger than it had been months before. He nodded, making space beside him on the leather sofa. As Mary read aloud, stumbling occasionally over difficult words, Robert felt a profound shift in his heart. This child, not his by blood but increasingly his by choice, had awakened something he thought long dead, the capacity to love unconditionally. After she finished reading, he said, "You remind me so much of your mother, her courage, her kindness." Mary's eyes brightened. "Will you tell me about her?" And so began their nightly ritual, stories exchanged, memories shared, wounds slowly healing. The bond between them grew not from obligation, but from genuine affection. A family rebuilt from broken pieces. In the shadows, Martha Johnson watched them with quiet satisfaction. The housekeeper knew that in this growing connection lay Mary's true salvation. and perhaps Robert's as well. The morning of Mary Smith's 9th birthday dawned crisp and clear over Whitfield Manor. Unlike previous birthdays spent in shadows, this one carried the weight of destiny. According to the estate's legal documents, this milestone unlocked the family trust and triggered a formal review of guardianship. In the grand library, with its towering bookshelves and imposing oak table, the trustees gathered. 3 solemn-faced solicitors from York, who had managed the Smith family affairs for generations. Mary entered wearing a simple blue dress, her battered doll tucked under one arm. Though small for her age, she walked with quiet determination. "Are you certain you wish to proceed?" Robert Smith asked gently, his hand warm on her shoulder. "This isn't how most children spend their birthday." The child nodded. "Some birthdays aren't for cake," she replied, her voice steadier than anyone expected. Elizabeth swept in, immaculately dressed in pearls and silk, confidence radiating from her perfect posture. Her smile faltered only slightly when she noticed the organized stack of journals on the table. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, eyeing Mrs. Johnson, who stood discreetly by the door, hands clasped before her apron. The head trustee cleared his throat. "We're here to review a provision in the original deed. Any proven act of cruelty toward the rightful heir automatically voids guardianship claims." Mary stepped forward, placing her collection of evidence on the polished surface, drawings documenting her banishment outdoors, diary entries dated and witnessed by staff, the recovered letters from her mother. "I was locked outside in winter," she stated simply. "I was denied food when I spoke of my mother. I was told I was worthless." Robert presented the journals they discovered, his voice thick with emotion. "My late sister-in-law documented everything, fearing for her daughter's safety. Elizabeth forged letters to drive me away, ensuring no one would protect Mary." Thomas's father stepped forward, his weathered hands steady. "I witnessed the night Mrs. Smith fell ill. It wasn't natural causes, as we were told." As each piece of evidence emerged, Elizabeth's composure cracked. The forged letters, the hidden will, the testimonies from staff who could no longer remain silent. "These are lies," she hissed, but her protests rang hollow against the mountain of truth. The trustees conferred briefly before delivering their verdict. The silence that followed wasn't triumphant or dramatic, just the quiet exhale of justice, long delayed. Elizabeth didn't scream or rage. Her power dissolved in a moment of stunned, shattering silence as she realized her carefully constructed world had collapsed completely. Mary stood tall, her eyes clear and unafraid. This birthday marked not just another year, but the beginning of truth's reign at Whitfield Manor. Thomas's family moved into the renovated cottage near the eastern edge of the estate grounds. What had once been a dilapidated structure now stood proudly with fresh paint and sturdy walls. Robert Smith had personally overseen the renovations, ensuring the gardener and his family would never again face the threat of homelessness that Elizabeth had wielded against them. "Your father served alongside me when we were young men," Robert told Thomas one crisp afternoon as they planted oak saplings along the drive. "His loyalty deserves more than I could ever repay." Thomas's father stood taller these days, his weathered hands working the soil with renewed purpose. The shadow of fear that had hung over the staff quarters had lifted like morning mist, replaced by a sense of security many had never known at Whitfield Manor. Mrs. Martha Johnson reorganized the household staff with gentle authority, undoing years of Elizabeth's divisive management. The housekeeper had kept every one of Mary's drawings, presenting them in a leather-bound album as a testament to the child's journey. "You've brought life back to these walls, Mrs." Johnson whispered to Mary one evening, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "We serve this house with pride again." Throughout the manor, servants who had once averted their eyes now greeted Mary warmly. The cook prepared her favorite strawberry tarts without fear of reprimand. The groundskeeper taught her the names of birds that nested in the estate's ancient trees. Mary accepted these changes with quiet dignity beyond her years. She didn't demand attention or special treatment. Instead, she moved through the grand halls with thoughtful steps, pausing sometimes to trace the wooden panels her mother had once touched. On Sunday afternoons, Mary could be found in the library with her battered doll, reading aloud from her mother's journals. Robert often joined her, adding his own memories to the stories, filling gaps in Mary's understanding of her heritage. "Your mother loved this place," he would say, "not for its grandeur, but for the life it could nurture." Mary took these words to heart. She established a small scholarship for village children, funded from her trust. Thomas was its first recipient. His quick mind now promised the education Elizabeth had tried to deny him. The triumph that had unfolded at Whitfield Manor wasn't marked by fanfare or celebration. It manifested in quieter ways, in the straightening of Mary's shoulders as she walked the corridors that were rightfully hers, in the confidence with which she carried her cherished doll, and in the gentle wisdom that seemed to echo her mother's presence in every decision she made. The Yorkshire seasons painted Whitfield Manor in ever-changing colors: spring blossoms, summer greens, autumn golds, and winter whites. 5 years had passed since that stormy night when Mary Smith stood shivering at the back door. The estate that once felt like a prison now breathed with new life, its rooms filled with warmth that no fireplace alone could provide. Mary, now 14, walked the gravel paths with confident steps, her once frail frame grown stronger, her imagination even more vibrant. She carried her mother's journals everywhere, the pages dog-eared and beloved. The battered doll that had once hidden secrets now sat proudly on her bedroom shelf, a reminder of battles won and truths uncovered. Robert Smith watched his ward with quiet pride as they inspected the greenhouse renovations together. His silver hair caught the afternoon light as he leaned on his cane, discussing the new scholarship program they'd established for local children. "You've given this place a soul again," he told her, his voice gruff with emotion. Mary smiled, touching the locket at her throat. "We both did." The staff moved with ease through the manor now, Mrs. Martha Johnson orchestrating household affairs with dignity restored. She had become something of a grandmother to Mary, teaching her the intricate dance of managing an estate with compassion rather than fear. In the gardens, Thomas had grown tall and thoughtful, apprenticing under his father while studying horticulture. Their friendship had blossomed alongside the roses they tended, built on shared secrets and mutual respect. The greenhouse where they once hid to read picture books now housed an extensive library, open to village children every Saturday. Elizabeth had departed for London years ago, her schemes unraveled, her power dissolved. The village no longer whispered her name. Instead, they spoke of Whitfield's transformation, how its gates stood open for community gatherings, how music drifted from windows once shuttered tight. On summer evenings, Mary often played the piano while Robert told stories of distant lands, their voices mingling with laughter from the staff quarters. The manor that once echoed with silence now resonated with conversation, debate, and occasional harmless mischief. The estate's ledgers, once manipulated for personal gain, now recorded charitable endeavors and educational initiatives. Mary had turned her inheritance into opportunity for others, guided by Robert's business acumen and her own unfailing moral compass. As twilight settled over Whitfield, Mary sometimes walked to that back door, remembering the child who had stood there, clutching a blanket and a fading lantern. The memory no longer brought pain, only gratitude for how far she had come, surrounded by the family she had found, in the home she had reclaimed, with the truth she had fought to uncover.